Good morning. Welcome to Rakestraw Books Live at Home with William Boyd. My name is Michael Barnard. I own Rakestraw Books here in Danville, California. And William is joining us from London. We're going to be discussing Trio, his most recent novel, which was just published in the US in paperback. A couple of housekeeping details. If you have questions this morning, you can drop them into the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen. Or if you type them into chat and include a question mark, it will offer you the option of adding it to the question box. Please do. It makes my life easier when I'm starting to pull questions from all of you at the end. William's going to talk about the book for a couple minutes, and then I will come back and we will chat for about half an hour, and then I will start pulling questions from all of you. So thank you for joining us. It is a true pleasure to have William Boyd with us, even virtually. I have been reading his books since I was a teenager, since my mother encouraged me to read The New Confessions, which has been on my short list of favorites ever since. Trio is dark and funny. I finished rereading it last night. It kept me up too late. And even the second go through, it's just terrific fun. And it's a joy to have him here. So I'm going to let him talk about the book for a few minutes, and then I will be back.
Well, I think it's always interesting to know about the kind of origins of the book. And the Trio started out with a kind of crazy idea I had. I thought I could write 3 short stories that I would publish simultaneously in a slipcase, and each short story would have a different color, and the reader could determine which color he or she would start with, and almost create their own narrative of the novel. And this idea obsessed me for a while, and I realized it was doable, and I blocked it all out. And I almost presented it to my publisher as my next book, when I realized that actually it was more of a gimmick than a novel or a kind of trio of long short stories. But the idea of 3 people stayed with me, because the way this story or this concept worked was that the 3 stories featuring the 3 people, all 3 people had a secret, and you could shuffle them up and it would make a narrative. But I abandoned that idea. But nothing is wasted. Everything can be recycled. And when I was thinking about this idea, it's kind of ripple effect, I thought, well, actually there is something to be said about writing about people's secret lives. And I'm obsessed with Anton Chekhov, the playwright and short story writer. And Chekhov said something very interesting, which I use as an epigraph of the novel, where he said that most people live their real and most interesting lives under the cover of secrecy. Well, depends on what you define as interesting, I suppose, but I thought it was an intriguing idea. So I took my abandoned idea and reconfigured it as a novel that featured 3 people, hence the title, Trio, and each person in the novel is living a secret life. And that secret life gradually becomes overwhelmed by their public lives, and there are consequences that are sometimes good, sometimes serene, sometimes disastrous. But the original gimmicky concept that I'd had lingered on, and that explains the structure of the novel. And then in the way that I work, I ask myself questions and I give myself answers, and that accretion of information builds into a narrative. And I thought, who are these people? What are their names? How old are they? What time are they living in? What are they doing? And one way or another, I came up with this idea that they were all 3 attached, sometimes importantly, sometimes tangentially, to a very stupid British film that was being filmed in Brighton on the south coast of England in 1968, which is a very significant year, and that's something we may get into later. But basically, the novel that I arrived at covers 2 months in the summer of 1968, where this zany kind of cool movie is being shot in this interesting provincial town. And the three characters are the producer of the film, who's a man called Talbot Kid, a man in his 60s who's a veteran of World War II, the very young American star of the film, who's called Annie Viklund, who's a huge star, but is, like many American stars, participating in this British movie. And the other person, the third person, and I think the person around whom the novel eventually revolves, is the wife of the film's director. And she is a woman called Elfrida Wing, and she is a novelist, but who's suffering a 10-year writer's block. So these characters, with their various problems, form the three protagonists of Trio and explain the title. And it's in the way their secret lives unravel and the way we, the readers, begin to understand them, makes up the kind of ambience of the novel, which is essentially comic, but underneath the surface there are much darker themes going on, because 1968 was a cataclysmic year in the world, a bit like the years we've just lived through or are living through. And the only place that seemed unaffected by it was Great Britain. So that was the setup, and that was the origins of the novel.
So let's talk about 1968, this strange watershed year, and why you chose that year. What was going on in your life that you wanted to revisit?
Well, I remember 1968. I was 16 years old, and I was at a boarding school in the north of Scotland, sitting my exams. In the summer of 1968, my parents, who lived in Africa, had come back to Scotland on leave, and we spent the summer in a seaside town in Fife called St Andrews. My parents both came from Fife, so it was a completely uneventful summer for me, and in a way that's typical, because 1968 was an extraordinary year globally. The Tet Offensive had just begun in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was at its most ferocious. So for Americans, 1968 started, shockingly badly, and got worse and worse with the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Elsewhere in the world, in France in May, there was a kind of almost another French Revolution, when the students and the school kids took to the streets, and there was kind of Battle of Paris. If you ask a German about 1968, it was also another year of youth upheaval. Same in Italy, same in Mexico. If you were looking on at the world in 1968, you might have thought that social order was collapsing. And the curious bubble that was the opposite to this global state of affairs was Great Britain. And the New York Times sent a journalist to London in 1968 to analyze the mood in the country. And he said, I paraphrase, nowhere have I seen such a disconnect between the mood of the population of a country and what's actually going on in the world. We were sort of obsessing about, will the Beatles break up, and we were kind of in this kind of crazy swinging London, swinging 60s mood, which was essentially frivolous, I think. I mean, there were problems in Britain, Northern Ireland and its problems were looming. There were problems with trades unions and the workforce, but essentially 1968 in Britain, we were just having a good time, party on. And this is reflected, interestingly, in the films that the British were making at the time. Started with I think Dick Lester's Beatles movie Hard Day's Night in 1965, but between 1965 and 1970 there was a little mini boom silly, zany, sexy, cool films with great soundtracks, and then it fizzled out when the 1970s arrived. So I plonked my story down in 1968 in this particular year, precisely to show how we the British were behaving differently from the rest of the world, that the angst that the rest of the world was suffering was not applying to us. But of course, it echoes the larger theme of the novel in the way that the public world, your public life, your public persona can overwhelm the secret private life you're leading. So slowly but surely, the world begins to intervene in Brighton in 1968, and slowly but surely the secret lives of my three characters begin to unravel or begin to resolve themselves or come to some sort of closure or understanding.
Although it's interesting, at the beginning of the novel, the secret lives that each of them is leading, they're almost secret from themselves. You know, as though they're not completely, they're you know, at least two of the characters are actively deluding themselves about the nature of their secret life.
Yes, you know, the producer Talbot is a gay man, but he's a gay man in his 60s, and Elfrida, the novelist, is a serious alcoholic, as well as somebody stuck with a massive writer's block. And the young film star Annie Viklund is in a way a kind of innocent, but who's a victim of her own success and the problems that success have brought. So they're sort of in denial, I suppose. And one of the sort of narrative arc of the novel is how they confront their secret lives and how they deal with them. And I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, but I mean, some are more successful than others, let's put it that way, at resolving that antithesis. So it's there's a lot going on under the surface of the problems, the daily problems of trying to make this very silly film.
I was struck. This is just a very small side note. We shouldn't linger on it, but I was struck by how wholly eclipsed Virginia Woolf's reputation seems to be in that moment. And Elfrida begins to be fascinated by her because she's being so frequently compared to her. And it never occurred to me that there would ever be a moment that Virginia Woolf wouldn't be revered. And
it's really interesting. This is something I discovered actually while I was researching the book, because I mean, I have a bit of a Virginia Woolf problem, because I, unfortunately, in my other life, or my early life, when I was a lecturer at the University of Oxford, I had to teach Virginia Woolf annually, and I must have taught at least 5 years worth of undergraduates to The Lighthouse, which is a book I've actually come to hate, probably because I've had to read it, teach it so many times. And Virginia Woolf has appeared in my novels before. She makes an appearance in my novel Any Human Heart, but she's a very interesting figure, I think, in English literature, and I think she's a very important figure, even though I'm not her biggest fan. I think her journals are her great work, if you like. The novels I have problems with, but all the same, she is a major figure in 20th century British literature. And my character Elfrida is described constantly as the new Virginia Woolf, which is an albatross around her neck, and she's trying to remove it. And the only way she thinks she can do this is by writing about Virginia Woolf, and maybe that will cure her writer's block. I knew somebody who knew Virginia Woolf very well. There's a curious 2 degrees of separation, and I've been to her house in in Rodmell village in East Sussex, and wandered around her garden, and been in her rooms, her sitting rooms, her study, and so on. But in 1968, she had no reputation at all. This is the interesting thing. She was regarded in a very patronizing way as a kind of middle class, lady novelist. And that Bloomsbury Revolution, which was just beginning to happen in the late 60s, I think, with the publication of Michael Holroyd's biography of Lytton Strachey, hadn't arrived. So if you said, what do you think about Virginia Woolf in 1968, people would have dismissed her. So it seems it's quite incongruous not incongruous, quite amazing how her lasting fame has arrived in the last half century, slowly but surely. But I did a lot of research that many of her books were out of print. There was no biography of her. The only book that dealt with her life was a very heavily edited version of her diaries that were published by her husband, a writer's diary. She was virtually an unknown author. So that was another little nugget of interesting information that I was able to factor into my novel, that actually in the late 60s, Virginia Woolf was regarded as a kind of minor novelist of not particular interest.
Well, I think also the feminist revolution of the 70s, particularly the beginning of women's publishing, Virago and so on, also brought absolutely. Her reputation back.
Yeah, everything. And then shortly after, in the early 70s, Quentin Bell published a 2-volume biography of her, and that in a way created the Virginia Woolf Bloomsbury boom, because he was her nephew and he'd known her, and it's still an extremely good biography, and suddenly everything changed in the way that authors' reputations can decline and suddenly be revived. I mean, in the 1940s, when she died, 1941, she was a very significant writer, and then 25 years later, nobody gave her any thought whatsoever, and now she's one of the greats of 20th century literature. So it's very interesting looking at the trajectory of her reputation.
I was very struck by your deep and heartfelt exploration of writer's block, because if there's one thing we cannot see, at least from the outside in your career, is writer's block. 20 novels, screenplays, essay collections.
Yes,
you don't seem to have been blocked for a minute.
I don't suffer from writer's block. I haven't suffered from it, but I think for every single writer who has any kind of career that endures, it's a terrifying fear over the horizon. And I have a good friend who's an extremely successful British novelist who had a near 10 years writer's block, and I know what it's like, from close acquaintance. But my way of avoiding it is always to have, while I'm writing a novel, always to have the idea of my next novel in my mind. And sometimes I might have 2 or 3 ideas, because I think it's when you finish a book and yet there's that moment of release and I did it, my God, how and then you think, well, what's next? And that's when, the terror descends. You think, I can't think of anything to write about. So I always have, like an airplane circling an airport waiting to come into land, the next idea, or sometimes I have 2 airplanes circling the airport waiting to come into land. So I do take preemptive measures to not get writer's block. And these ideas, which I've had maybe for several years, one of them will seize me, and I'll begin to write about it. I mean, for example, I've just finished a new novel, which I delivered to my publishers. It will be published in the UK in October this year, but I already know my next novel, so the block fear is not going to apply. I know what I'm going to write. Now I'm not going to start it for some months or maybe even a year, but I know exactly what I'm going to do next. And so phew, I can relax. But I can imagine a parallel scenario where I've handed in my new novel and I have no idea what to write next. And I think that's when writers write bad novels, because they just want to get anything out there, or else they just stop because they, the muse has not descended and they're not inspired and they don't know what to write. So it is I think it's an abiding fear in the mind, in the back of the mind of almost every writer. What if I don't know what to write next? And that's why I was able to write so convincingly about Elfrida's writer's block.
Well, when I was reading Elfrida, I kept thinking about Barbara Pym, who
Oh
had a
yeah.
very long sort of gap between the two parts of her writing life. That 10-year or 15-year gap between two relatively fertile periods.
Yeah, but wasn't she was abandoned by her publisher, I think.
Was she? Okay.
Her publisher, who I knew, actually, her publisher, deemed that her work was too old-fashioned and not of any interest to anyone. And so she went into this kind of fallow period. I think she was writing, and she was writing the same type of novels, but her publisher thought she was old hat. And it wasn't until, I think it was Philip Larkin, the poet, in one of these year-end roundups, who's the most underrated writer in Britain, he suddenly said Barbara Pym, and hey presto, her career revived. But I think Barbara Pym, wrote the same type of novel all through her writing life, but maybe she hit the 60s, the 1960s, where quiet lives in provincial towns was not deemed particularly cool or intriguing, and she was rejected by her publisher, and I think that caused her obvious consternation, and it was a real problem for her as a writer. But she it wasn't so much that she wasn't writing, it's just that she sort of seemed out of step with the zeitgeist, I think.
Right. So let's talk about film, because film in the world of film has played a recurring role in your novels, and perhaps not more than in this one. And you have, of course, another life in film yourself, as a director, as a screenwriter. And so you seem absolutely fascinated by it, and have done across.
Yeah, I think I think it's very, it's something to do with the culture in Britain for writers that, I think maybe it's the great exemplars of the 19th century, Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, George Eliot, that these writers were kind of dynamos of production. And so I think in our literary culture, if you're a writer, you write all the time. There's not a 10 or 6 year gap between books. And and so when I started writing in my late 20s, when my first novel was published, I always thought I would diversify. I've always written a lot of journalism, for example, and I wanted to write films, because I love movies, and I think I like collaborating. You have the perfect autonomy of a novel, but it's a solitary life, and actually working, in a film or TV series, you go to meetings, you have colleagues for a while. It's a collegiate enterprise. I think it's good for my soul. I always wanted to do it. It was never going to be my main job. I was always a novelist moonlighting in the world of film and television. But it's something I've done almost from the outset. My first novel was published in 1981, and my first film that I wrote was made in 1982. So I've had this parallel career, and I've also written for the theatre as well. I've had 3 plays produced, and so I do like that collaborative, creative enterprise, and it's been very enriching for me. As of the films I've written, I'm always very involved in them. I get to meet the actors. I'm very involved in the casting and the post-production. So it's fun as well as an interesting sideline. And also, more pragmatically, it subsidizes my novel writing in the sense that the money I earn from writing movies or television allows me the luxury of maybe taking an extra year or two to finish a book because I'm not dependent on that advance. So there are all sorts of reasons why I'm very glad I have this sort of double life. And of course, it has fed into my fiction, particularly in my novel, The New Confessions, which is the autobiography of a film director from the early years of the 20th century up to the end of the 20th century, and most particularly in Trio. But I've also written many short stories that touch on my experiences of the madness of the film world. I wrote a short story called The Destiny of Natalie X, which is the title of the collection that it appears in, which is a kind of my sort of fairy story of Hollywood, which was written 20 years ago, but is still alarmingly accurate. So it's been a very, very fruitful and useful and enjoyable parallel life to my life as a novelist.
Well, and the film in this novel is, as you said earlier, particularly ridiculous. But the star, poor Annie Viklund, is she modeled on someone?
Yeah, she's
inspired by somebody.
Loosely modeled on the actress Jean Seberg, who I don't know how well known she is today, but I mean, from my point of view, she was in the Jean-Luc Godard's kind of breakthrough movie Breathless, with Jean-Paul Belmondo, and she is a kind of tragic figure in the classic Hollywood mode, and she was plucked from obscurity by Otto Preminger. She was an unknown actor. She was in his film Saint Joan, which is about Joan of Arc. She became a sort of overnight sensation, and the terrible Faustian pact that you enter into as an actor when you achieve great fame, it can also destroy you, and it sort of destroyed Jean Seberg, and her life was particularly rackety. She became involved with the Black Panther movement in the 60s. She became surveilled by the CIA. I mean, there's even a very convincing conspiracy theory that she was murdered by the CIA. So she lurks behind the tragic figure of Annie Viklund, who's similarly experienced great fame at a very early age and is struggling to cope with it and its pressures.
And Annie is sort of caught up by the sort of the outside pressures of the 60s and the political unrest elsewhere in the world. Her ex-husband, yes. Her sort of quasi-current lover.
Yeah, I mean, you forget that in 68 was if you like, the beginnings of the urban terrorism that we have experienced subsequently, and even in the States, there was this group, the Weathermen. There was a kind of countercultural movement which was very radicalized and actually quite violent. And Annie, and quite apart from the whole problems of Black Power and the turmoil following the assassination of Martin Luther King, the sort of subterranean counterculture in the US, but also in Europe, at the beginning of the Baader-Meinhof group, the beginning of what's known in Italy as the Years of Lead, and the beginnings of the troubles in Ireland and Ulster with the IRA and the Provisional IRA. In a way, it's 1968 or the late 60s saw the beginnings of a kind of popular, radical urban terrorism that resorted to violence to propagate its values rather than, manifestos. And so Annie Wiklund, Jean Seberg, many other actors you could think of that era were caught up in it. And she is somebody who, through her emotional attachments, became involved in radical counterculture movements, but was not really, a paid up member of it, but paid the price for it.
Right. And both that ex-husband and that her sort of current lover are interested in Africa as a location for change and unrest and revolution. And Africa is another sort of theme that has recurred in your books.
Yes, inevitably, because I was born in West Africa and went to school there and grew up there, and so in a way, my home for the first 20 odd years of my life was in Africa. Very typical of the British professional middle classes to leave the home country and work abroad. My father was a doctor who specialized in tropical medicine, and he went out to Africa in 1950. My mother was a teacher. She taught in schools in Ghana and Nigeria. And so I was a typical, colonial boy in a way, in the sense that there was this huge diaspora of the British middle classes who were, earning their living in the former colonies, whether it was, India, Singapore, Jamaica, Africa, Kenya, Uganda, wherever. There was a huge British middle class who spent their working life out there. My father was completely typical. He went to Africa in 1950 and he left in 1978 when he became ill, but his entire working life was spent abroad. And I'm exactly a progeny of that type of colonial life. I'm very glad I am and was, because it was completely fascinating compared to the other lives I might have had, and it's provided me with a kind of incredible rich mulch of experience, and which has gone into various novels and so on, but it's also shaped me as a person. There's no doubt about it. My upbringing and my experiences as a child and as a teenager and as a young man in Africa have completely shaped my attitudes of the kind of person I am today. I haven't overanalyzed them, but as I'm getting older, I can look back and see how that experience had to, suppose I had been born and raised in Scotland as my father had been, I think I would be an entirely different person than the person I am today. That's true of everybody, of course. You are a good victim of the circumstances of your life, but there's no doubt that the strangeness and the exoticism of my early life, which to me was entirely normal, just the background to my growing up, has had a profound effect on me.
So let's just talk briefly about the third major character of the novel, Talbot Kid, who is in some ways, this perfect, he had a good war. He's a gentleman. He has a nice life, but he's also stranded in a way. Old at a time when youth is, or beginning to be old at a time when youth is everything. Not able to be true to himself.
Yes, and I mean, Talbot is, he's married. He has 2 grown-up children, but in fact, he's a gay man. And I'm old enough as well to know many people of that generation who were married with children, but whose sexuality was fundamentally different from the sexuality that they were presenting to the public world. And another thing about 1968 that's significant is that in 1967 in Britain, homosexuality was legalized, and suddenly what had been hidden and was illegal was suddenly overt and not illegal. And for young people, it was a tremendous liberation. But for a man like Talbot, who's in his 60s, it was a highly confusing situation to find himself in. And in a way, his journey through the novel is an attempt to come to terms with these new liberties and these new permissions, if you like, having lived his life, having lived his secret life. And it is a real double life in that he has a different home. He comports himself differently in this flat he has in North London, as opposed to his life with his wife and children. And so it's an investigation of that, sudden and, to some people, shocking watershed of social legislation that took place in the late 1960s in Britain and around the world, and how people came to terms with it. And so Talbot's case, he's trying to, he's herding cats, trying to keep this film on the road, but at the same time, his private life, his secret life, is in a similar kind of turmoil, and it's how he manages to, square that complicated circle that makes his journey through the book, particularly interesting and I think quite poignant.
Yeah, he becomes almost unmoored at a certain point.
Yeah, he does. And he's almost like he's entered it's like he's, Alice in Wonderland. He's fallen down a rabbit hole and emerged in a world where everything that he tried to hide and keep concealed is now perfectly, able to be revealed and celebrated. And he can't quite handle it.
So the last thing I want to talk about, just for a minute or two before we cut to questions. So again, if you have questions, do put them into chat or put them into the Ask a Question box. Rereading the novel last night, the great set piece of Dorian Villiers' party is just so wonderfully ridiculous and delightful. And the way it brings all three of the major characters together before spinning them out again. It's such a fun scene or set of scenes.
Yes, I look back through my novels, and I see that I tend to do this. I have dinner parties that go disastrously wrong, or weddings or anniversaries. There's something about crowding your characters together in an environment that is incipiently disastrous that adds to the kind of suspense and the frisson of the moment. And actually, you're absolutely right. That is at the center of the novel, where the trio come together and they sort of tangentially interconnect, and it also changes the format of the novel. I've been very rigid about keeping one chapter per character. Then suddenly you get the party, and so you cut between the various Elfrida and Talbot and Annie and their particular response to this possibly horrendous occasion, and it's very funny, but it allows me as a novelist to put them in situations which I often do, where I test them, and see how they respond. But it's also tangentially to do with the nature of Brighton, which is if you don't know the city on the south coast of England, a character in the novel describes it as the Las Vegas of England, in the sense that when you go to Brighton, you're licensed to behave more badly than you would in your hometown. And so it still has this reputation today as a slightly louche, kind of cool and edgy place. And it got that reputation because the Prince Regent, who was a notorious sort of rake and philanderer, made his home in Brighton. And so that kind of atmosphere of well-heeled lechery and self-indulgence has sort of stayed with the town, even though I'm sure the mayor of Brighton would disagree vehemently with me today. But it has, for those of us who don't live in Brighton, and I know it very well, It's only about an hour and a half from London, and I have many friends who live there. It still has this reputation as a rather naughty place, and so creating this huge, bacchanalian party, but from this monster of an actor, Dorian Villiers, is in a way a curious backhanded tribute to the town.
Yes, the kind of man who would have a ballroom in his house in 1968.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, Laurence Olivier lived in Brighton with Vivian Leigh, and lots of actors and well-known people have made their home there. Even today, rock stars and film stars and DJs choose to live in Brighton. It's not London, but it has a kind of similarly sophisticated vibe to it.
Right. And it didn't, I think Brighton and didn't they do something recently politically, refusing to recognize the titles of Prince Harry and his wife or something like this? I vaguely remember a news story.
Yeah, I mean, Brighton has the only Green Member of Parliament in the British Houses of Parliament, so it's already set apart in that way. And I think I'm trying to think what you refer. They refused to acknowledge, or they cancelled somebody who they deemed unsuitable to be associated with the town. But I don't think it was Meghan and Harry somehow, but certainly somebody. Maybe it was a Russian oligarch. They it out, good for them.
Well, prescience there.
Yes.
So let's hopefully get some questions from our audience, because I have more questions, but I would love to hear from all of you. So you said you just finished a novel that will be out in October. Is it scheduled for publication here as well?
Yes, I think it'll probably be out about a year from now. I says my US publication seems to be in the spring, following the sort of autumn publication in the UK. So I'm assuming it'll follow that pattern. And I can tell you a bit about it. It's called The Romantic. And it's one of my whole life novels. It follows a life from cradle to grave, but it's set entirely in the 19th century. Starts in 1799 and it ends in 1882. So I have done a ton of work researching it, and boy does he have an interesting life. So it's an epic.
You've done a couple of those now. Any Human Heart and New Confessions were both whole life novels.
Yeah, and Sweet Caress, my distant one. Yes, my photographer novel. It's sort of become. Something I had never planned to do them, but when I wrote the New Confessions, it was quite early in my career. 1987, it was published, and it's so they're all big novels. They're all 500 pages or close to 500 pages, but it's something different happens when you write a novel of about a whole life. And even long novels of the 19th century, you think, oh, didn't Dickens and Trollope and Thackeray do that? No, they didn't. They used to write bits of a life, maybe 30 years or 40 years. But to do, cradle to grave is quite unusual. It's a very small subgenre of the novel, in fact. And something I inadvertently did with the New Confessions in 1987, and have done it. This is my fourth, actually. So I think what happens is that you give the reader all the information about an individual, and that's different from a novel in a way, because you only get a bit of a life, maybe in extreme detail, like think of James Joyce's Ulysses, but to follow a character through the 7 ages of man or of woman is quite unusual. And the effect of reading that story, I think, in my experience, that readers respond to it in a slightly different way than they respond to an orthodox novel. It's as if
Right.
that character becomes somehow real and has had a real life. And that's something else I've tried to do in my writing life, to make my fiction seem so real that you begin to forget it's fiction.
Right. Robertson Davies was another one who liked doing that. I think of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Canadian novelist.
yes, I
He
know.
did a
Yes,
couple as well.
yeah, Anthony Burgess wrote one.
Right.
You could say Hilary Mantel has done that with her trilogy of Thomas Cromwell.
Right.
But we're running out of examples already. So it is a
We are.
small
We are.
little subgenre of the novel, but rich and fruitful.
Well, John James Todd is still one of my. I think part of the reason New Confessions stays on my short list is that he's such a wonderfully fun and compelling character, um, and the scrapes that he gets into in his life.
Yes, and I think it's also to do with the way you tell the story. I mean, New Confessions is written as an autobiography, so it's John James Todd telling the story of his life. But as it progresses, the reader realizes that actually the reader is in more possession of information than the author. Any Human Heart is written as a series of journals, which is a different way of writing about your life, because there's no backward glance, there's no wisdom of hindsight, and so that changes the way it's perceived also. And this new novel I've written is a kind of biography. I am writing a novelized biography of this person's life, so I'm a kind of editorial presence within it. So these are technical decisions you take on how to tell the story of a life, and they have a real effect on how the reader responds.
Well, and I think a journal without the backward glance is also maybe written with less of an eye to an audience, and so maybe it's less delusion or less misleading or less intentionally
Yes,
misdirecting or
yes, it's the intimate journal. It's a kind of confession, but as you write, day by day, week by week, you don't know what's going to be important because you haven't got that wisdom, that benefit of hindsight. And so journals are often completely wrong, about the direction that the person writing it is going to take. That fleeting encounter you had in the pub, may end up the person you're married to. So it's a very tricky form to use as a fiction, because you have to make it like a real journal, but it has that incredible sense of immediacy which a biography or an autobiography doesn't have.
Right. And it also our inability to distance in a journal sort of feels like our relationship to the events that we are living through, where it's hard to find what matters in the moment, and it's only years or decades later that, as history sort of finds its level, that we know what we've lived through.
Yeah, exactly.
And that seems to come up in your books again and again.
The literary form that most approximates to the way we live, any of us, day by day, is the diary of the journal. And so it's, I've kept a diary since I was 19. It's a monstrous document of many millions of words, and it's of extreme interest only to me. But I can look back at it and see how wrong I was about things. And also I can look back and see what I've forgotten about things, because you forget that memory is almost as creative as your imagination. You often remember how you wish your life had been rather than how it was. And so there's something about, I'm a great reader of journals, and I have a great collection of journals, and rightfully there are journals are amongst the greatest writers. Virginia Woolf, for example, her journal, I think, is her great work, along with Samuel Pepys and James Boswell and whoever else, Sylvia Plath, whoever else. It's a very, very revealing but often wrongly interpreted view of an individual's life, which makes it all the more intriguing if you have that novel yourself, that knowledge yourself.
Right. We have a couple questions from the audience. AJ asks about the cover art on the US edition of Trio and what you think of it. It seems such a departure from your usual covers.
Well, it's very interesting. I know the designer of the cover extremely well. She's called Megan Wilson. She's designed the covers of all my paperbacks and quite a few of my hardbacks as well. And I think she's an absolutely brilliant designer of book covers, one of the greats. And so I trust her judgment absolutely implicitly. The cover in the States is completely different from the UK one, as is the French one, and as is the German one. Not surprisingly, because different publishers, different cultures. But I think that the cover of the paperback, which is the same as the hardback, actually picks up the more comic, light-hearted aspect of Trio, and very succinctly and brilliantly says, we're on the coast, it's summer, there's a movie being made, and the camera is pointing at a female film star. So it's a very catchy and succinct distillation of that one aspect of the novel. There are, as I say, it is a comic novel, unashamedly comic novel, but it's a serious comic novel. And there's a lot of darkness lurking under the sunlight and the sun on the waves,
Right. And no plan for rain.
No, but it is Britain, so it will rain inevitably.
Yes. So do you think novels are becoming, this is a question from Peter, do you think novels are becoming more deliberately cinematic? He just finished Utopia Avenue, also about the 60s, and feels that it is more cinematic than Mitchell's previous novels.
Well, I have very strong opinions about this, because as somebody who writes novels and writes films, and have directed a feature film as well, I'm so aware of the massive difference between the two art forms. The novel is a world of total freedom. Film, and I mean include television in this, is a world of compromises and parameters and impossibilities. Because film is photography, there's basically one point of view. It's relentlessly objective. The novel is effortlessly subjective. So, and there's also another argument that all the devices that we see in cinema were present in the novel before cinema was invented. You can read Madame Bovary. Flaubert didn't see a movie, but you've got close-ups, slow motion, parallel action, cross-cutting, etc., etc. All the narrative devices of film are present in the novel before film was ever invented. So the traffic, if you like, is not from film to novel, it's from novel to film. And I think when you look closely at the two art forms, I mean, I love movies, and film has its clear strengths, but there's no doubt that the utter liberty of the novel makes it a far more generous art form than cinema. And there's a very facetious remark that I always quote, which is like, writing a novel is like swimming in the sea. Writing a film is like swimming in the bath. You're immersed in water, and you can sort of go through the motions, but you're not going to get anything like the experience you get from swimming in the sea. And I think that's very, it's glib, but it's very true. The film is a difficult and constrained world for a writer, and the novel is the exact opposite. So I think that novels have always been cinematic, and cinema has simply copied or replicated that.
Right. Well, we have time for maybe one more. So Neha is asking what you are reading right now, what you are thinking about, what you're reading.
Well, it's quite interesting. I always have several books on the go at any one time, and I don't know if anybody else has this reading pattern. I'm reading. I'm rereading Vladimir Nabokov's novel Ada, which was something of a flop, but I read it a long time ago. I'm rereading. I'm a great Nabokov fan. I'm also reading a biography of Elia Kazan, who is a very, very interesting film and theatre director. I'm dipping into a book about James Joyce's early years. I'm a great Joycean. I'm sort of obsessed with Joyce as a person in the same way as I'm obsessed with Chekhov as a person. And this is a book called James Joyce, The Years of Growth, that looks at his life from 1882 when he was born to 1915, when he's left Dublin and for the last time pretty much, and by Peter Costello. And I've just ordered Anne Tyler's latest novel, which should be arriving in a couple of days. And I also read a lot of poetry. I'm reading a friend of mine who I think is the greatest living British poet called Jamie McKendrick, just recently produced his selected poems. So I'm reading that. So I have a very varied, depending on my mood and where I am in the house, I can pick up a book and read a few pages. And somehow it doesn't seem to bother me that I, stop and start and chop and change. I still derive immense reading pleasure from all these books that are currently underway.
Right. Well, it's like having several friends. You can have different conversations and different relationships,
Pop
and they don't diminish each other.
Come in and have a drink or a cup of coffee, and
right.
We'll chat for half an hour. Exactly.
So, well, this has been a lovely hour of chat. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's been a great pleasure, and I'm delighted to be. Thanks to the wonders of technology, I'm delighted to be in your bookstore, Michael. And
thank you.
Thanks for everybody for tuning in.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Go out and enjoy the weekend. Come by the bookshop, pick a book, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.